Hello everyone, today we talk about Western European Army around 1205 approximately, and we pick some typical figures, mixing them a little bit for talking about this or that feature of their armor, mostly in this case also the surcoat that is starting to appear consistently, in fact from the beginning of the 13th century. And this type is best exemplified from the Charlemagne reliquary in the treasury in the Hagen Cathedral, dating to 1200, 1207 roughly. Albeit, and I couldn't find a copyright-free picture of it, but you can Google it and you'll see fundamentally what we're talking about. But at the same time, there are substantially identical figures in the Charlemagne window of around 1210 at Chartres Cathedral, right? The Charlemagne ones, because there are different types, and you can see, all right, Chartres and Aachen are not completely from two opposite sides of Europe, but this naturally exemplifies the interconnection existing in the West fundamentally. In terms of arms and armor development at that point, the homogeneity of it in areas that were also dramatically feudal in nature, so they were kind of pioneering the technological advancement in equestrian warfare, but not just. And some of the main differences from previous knights types, we could say, could be in these years the as we were saying before, the substantial introduction of the surcoat, right? And also some changes in helmet type. Now, surcoats that in the contemporary sources are actually called gowns, sometimes at least, were introduced probably in imitation of Saracen dress of some sort. At least this is the main hypothesis. I'm not completely convinced of it. This is naturally part of the broader idea that for which the West should have imported so many know-how or practices, techniques, tactics, etc. from technologies from the Near East, from the Crusades. I think the story is a bit different. It would be also interesting to compare the development between the two areas, right? And the reason for this, in part, is being explained in a mechanical sense. Sometimes I said to things like, for example, the surcoat could have prevented, in part at least, armor from overheating in the sun. I don't think the surcoat could, protect from other kind of, for example, of colder weather, whatever. And it's obvious that, the heating, especially the transmission, of heat through even the same substance, the materials of the surcoat, or just even across the rings and so on, might have at that point cooked the knight even without such thing, right? A 13th century source says that the surcoat was to prevent the armor from getting wet instead, which is also probably not the most convincing explanation either. Right, and the surcoats didn't appear in Western sources by the beginning of the 13th century, but by the mid-12th at the latest. Right, we have, for example, the seal of Valérien de Beaumont, Count of Melun and Earl of Worcester, this Norman knight, with the seal dates to 1141, 1142. Right, and that's, as far as I know, the first pictorial representation of it in the West, which means, however, that they were still around, especially to figure in such sources, because this was it was an important ability fundamentally. So the spread was gradual. Probably it does overlap in a sense. We should go back to to Muslim sources and chronology to see also in there how the surcoat spread and how and why in which dimension. So consider that, of course, the military systems were slightly different, and also it depends. I don't know. The Seljuks were different from the Egyptians. There is I'm prone to believe that most of the surcoat spread had to do with the diversification of, with the need of essentially of signaling, right, of a sort of uniformity, necessity for identifying the various knights. In fact, there are even earlier indirect sources of such a thing. For example, there is a 12th century Muslim writer, Usama, stating, for an incident occurred around 1127, that I presume this is for probably a Western knight. The description of a long green and yellow silk surcoat, as you will see, a silk will be there normally also for the also archaeologically documented surcoats in later time. It's just so that the surcoat wouldn't been worn widely, at least until the early 13th century. These surcoats were normally sleeveless, right, generally, albeit some could have long sleeves as well. Sleeves were renowningly split at the front and the back to facilitate riding, and also probably adding, more, say, less impediment to certain movements, and they were usually belted by a cord at the waist. Quite simple. And regarding the colors, they appear to have been usually white, or at least self-colored initially, so not particularly, functionalized to that kind of codified recognition. But by the end of the 12th century, so where also heraldry had, importantly developed, that there were new needs of uniformities, etc. It had in fact begun to carry some devices, right? Albeit this is not true for all surcoats, right? Because they were worn by different people who had different status and different, and also maybe this was not necessarily discriminant. For example, in the 13th century still, Joinville implies in one passage of his chronicle about Louis IX reign that in France the surcoats were still plain even at that time, which is interesting because France would have been the place where that greatest development of heraldic signaling, say, would have been developed by that point, which may mean different things, by the way, such as that, for a broader need of recognition, for example, of a single unit, you could just have everybody kind of wearing a self-color, right, and not much else, right? The most important thing was the cohesion of the unit in combat, staying under the banners, right? So, and just even the status, like the individuals were recognized by for example, the wealth of their equipment. Still, at this point, even kings wouldn't look dramatically different from the other knights of the high nobility, fundamentally. Then we had, I don't know how it went lost, but until the 19th century, an actual fragment of a mid-13th century surcoat, right, which was described by the authors of the 19th century as being made of a coarse linen overlaid with fine linen, right, on which the coat of arms was worked in embroidery and other pieces of sewn on linen in the appropriate colors, which naturally speaks for this, outer, even properly aesthetical, but also, psychological effect, right, that aside from the actual device, the appearance had to properly provide. You would be surprised how concretely, visual certain needs were in common. This is true, and I made some videos about these topics, about the psychological effect of appearance properly in combat, right? You have to imagine all this helmet, in the same armor, they were usually all colored, right? They were all shiny. There was at least, in maybe not after a dramatic campaign, but still, like, there were different occasions also to wear certain things, right? And there was a general colorful and brightness and shininess that was really impressive and came all together with this sense of empowerment. And even the color, the appearance, the spirit that lived within those devices, the symbol of the family, of the coat of arms, actually embodied, right, in a way that was one together with the knight, right? It's still a bit, the animal warriors wearing skins, right, to kind of get that kind of strength from it. In a sense, yeah, even if it was very mediated at this point, it was still the same thing conceptually, and very much so, and even in different ways, but still importantly and greatly so, because of the structure of the kingdoms, of the faith, etc. And silk here was named as it was frequently used, as a matter of fact, and that serric look is definitely very captivating, even just to the eye, as we know. The cost could be enormous. For example, King Philip IV of France, right, telling Joinville that he had a surcoat so sumptuously embroidered that costed as much as 800 livres parisis. So an enormity. Okay, that was the King of France, the most powerful individual in Europe at that point. But concretely, that gives you a dimension of how expensive things that you would think, it has just to go in combat. Well, not only, of course, there was some necessity of parade. The King of France would have more than them, but let's say being able to display such luxury, even in circumstances that you would think were, in fact, a waste of such, because you can imagine the damage just in combat they couldn't undergo. It was not important because psychologically it was a way to say, I am this too. Like, even in knowing the cost of what you were wearing, was a reason more to feel comforted, supported, inspired, spurred, right? And so for the enemy to fear you in the same way, to say, who is this person who is so confident to go out there, even with just so much power, so much wealth displayed. And speaking of helmets, here we're in an interesting transitional phase from, let's say, the cap type to the closed one, the home of the 13th century. That does correspond, as you know, in this broader happening of cavalry, of mounted warfare, the also political and socially the development properly of a higher class of knights, right, distinguished as the high nobility from the rest of the knights, that were ever more trained in a collective fashion, for which the properly also the frontal charge, right, in a thickly packed formation against the enemy coming frontally, was reinforcing the need of protection, especially for the face, where the spear was, the lance was pointed at normally when you would charge each other. Also naturally because other weapons were coming around, such as crossbows and so on. So it's a bit all of this, but especially for the facial protection of the knight, that starts appearing here like a mask, like a face guard, right? Another plate armor, essentially attached to the helmet, is that covering the face is revealing mostly that kind of avoiding hit for the face. Also, the eye slits, as you know, will get ever thinner. They needed still to breathe in it. It was difficult, right? As also the holes in such masks were to come also with the home, and the later developments are quite important in the process, all to protect the knight mostly, not only, but any kind of frontal, right, challenge, as these face guards were actually leaving open other parts of the head that were lateral, right? Even the temples that are dramatically fragile, right, were not covered at this point. It was just the face, and the so this there are different types. There are many examples from Spain, Germany, England, etc. At least the most representatives here. We're not going in details, but they appeared, let's say, around 1195 circa, right? It's sometimes striking how, again, such armor development was uniform even in a few years all over Europe, right? That gives you a dimension of how deeply intertwined all Western Europe fundamentally was, and how fast also such development for those time standards, technological potential actually was, right? For everybody to kind of receive this with a shared need. This was not much a matter of imitation. It was properly a matter of need. It was perceived. So also the homogeneity of this feudal system and its warfare all over Europe, Western Europe at least. And there were interesting solutions, not much for the face guard itself, but for the rest of the helmets form. Some were kind of caps-like, others kind of be more round in shape, cylindric in shape and flat at the top. I mean, there is an interesting one dating to 1217, for example, that extends back, further down the neck, right? Which is interesting because eventually helmets would have gone also that direction, but closing actually the whole face too. So this happened by grades. I mean, and the obviously added to the helmet and the mail and the coif, underneath there was also the so-called arming cap, which remained in use almost unchanged up to the mid-16th century, and during the 13th it became common headwear, let's say, at least seemingly for the lower classes, in peace as well, right? This was kind of fundamentally a padded protection. It could be reinforced further, etc. And it would be like, it's interesting to study these things, because you would imagine that protecting your head was kind of the first thing you would have wanted to do in general in combat, right? And a minimal form of protection was always there, but sometimes the iconographic sources do not quite represent that. One might wonder why. Also, the arming cap could be worn, as we're saying, just for also civilian use, right? To be exposed in the sun, the weather in general. And it's in combat, it's common to be found in manuscript illustrations without helmet for foot soldiers, at least in certain concepts. That naturally has a sense, given that these troops were normally less involved in, let's say, often, not always, right? Because we have this idea, especially in feudal warfare, that infantry was subordinated, right, to the cavalry elite. This is not true. I mean, this is true at this point. It's correct in Europe, etc. But there were some types of infantry would also take the initiative and had even a specific anti-cavalry function, and that sometimes they were the same dismounted horsemen, especially in the earlier period, that would have such capabilities. So heavier infantry always existed, but generally the lighter one that mostly used, also spears, I mean, would stay at distance from the enemy. Didn't have necessarily enough protection even to come to come to hand-to-hand combat conveniently. They wouldn't even spend too much protecting their head, right? Which is also an interesting consideration, especially when you think about properly masses of troops that are like the infantry, that was, individually were less qualitative, but altogether, let's say, their strength came, of course, from the collectivity, as much as, it's true for every unit, but let's say they were more, right, numerically. So even the chance of being hit maybe was less than a knight, right? Because imagine that if you have, 100 cavalry and 1,000 infantry, right? If you crossbows are mostly going to shoot at at the knights, right? There's no way. And so even the chances for the infantry to be hit at parity of a missile is lower. So in terms of broader organizational costs that at this point are not much a matter of the individual per se, but rather, you know, monarchies starting to pay for the equipment, distributing and so on, was also a thing. Saying, let's not give these guys helmets, let's give them, you know, padded protection. And or there were other things where you can find infantry with mail quaff, with iron helmet, of course. And this really depends, but in general, for these times, we can approximate, just for the sake of illustration, of you know, disclosure, such profiles stereotypically. All right, for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.